So I'd like to thank the persons first who were gracious enough to have participated in the civic action that my book documents, for having allowed me into their lives. One of the pastors who was involved in faith-based community organizing, after he read the draft of my manuscript, he said, "I have to admit, I feel a little bit exposed." So I realized that people really put themselves out there in vulnerable ways, for me to learn and understand their lives and to learn about what this tells us in ways that a lot of us have never opened ourselves up. So I want to take time to acknowledge that, and I also want to thank Jennifer Elena Cosileon, a recent PhD graduate and ACLS Mellon Fellow this year. Jennifer researched, analyzed, and wrote parts of this book with me. So the title of my talk today is Prophetic Redemption, Faith-Based Community Organizing for and Among the Formerly Incarcerated. The material is drawn from the second chapter of my book, Jesus Saved an Ex-Con, Political Activism and Redemption After Incarceration. So to start, I want to ask, what is organizing? Does anyone want to try to take a stab at it? Maybe some examples of organizing? Yes.
Like getting people together to work towards a common goal.
Yeah, getting people together to work towards a common goal. Can we think of any examples of organizing? Any examples that come to mind? Yes, in the back.
Goes back a while, but the United Farm Workers, Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, these are great examples. United Farm Workers, Black Lives Matter, right? The Civil Rights Movement, the women's marches that happened, back in 2016. There's a lot of great examples that we have of organizing. The reason why I open up this conversation right now is because most scholars of social movements have focused on large-scale national movements. Scholars of local social movements, however, have argued that local social movements don't get nearly enough attention. They argue that it is in the space of local social movements that much of the civic capacity for creating social change is enabled. So when you see like something big happening on a national level, I think Kenneth Andrews, sociologist Kenneth Andrews has been one to argue this. He says that the civil rights movement was a lot of community organizing happening in different places all at the same time in a way that coalesced into something bigger. Okay, but people who study local social movements would say this is where a lot of civic capacity is built before anything happens on a national level that we witness. Unfortunately, as scholars, a lot of times we show up, right as something is happening. We don't see the process of how something was built. So I'm showing a picture of Pastor Michael McBride. In 2012, Pastor McBride became the director of PICO's Lifelines to Healing campaign. This was a national anti-mass incarceration, anti-deportation initiative that involved hundreds of congregations. In 2014, after Ferguson, Pastor McBride joined the Ferguson uprisings. Here you can see him leading a protest with college students at UC Berkeley. He was one of several pastors who actually flew in and got arrested during the protests in Ferguson. And I'm including a quote from Marshall Gans that defines community organizing. For those of you that don't know, Marshall Gans was one of the core people that worked with Cesar Chavez during the United Farm Worker movement. So Marshall Gans defines organizing as organizers identify, recruit, and develop leadership. They build community around leadership and build power out of community. Organizers motivate action by deepening people's understanding of who they are, what they want, and why. Okay, so I'm offering this definition because I want to be clear about what organizing is. Organizing is not activism. An activist tells someone, I'm right, you're wrong, you need to change the issue that you prioritize or your stance on an issue. An organizer finds out what someone is already impassioned about and finds ways to give them tools to become empowered around that thing they're already impassioned about. The type of civic capacity building that PICO, such as Pastor Michael McBride here, the type of civic capacity building that PICO did is part of my book. And I talk about the Alley Voice chapter of the PICO National Network in Los Angeles. But I also talk about the Community Renewal Society in Chicago, which is Chicago's oldest social justice organization. And so that's the case that I'm going to focus on today. So the material for my talk from today is drawn from my book, particularly from the second chapter. I'm going to be talking about the activities of the Community Renewal Society, as well as the activities of fighting to overcome records and create equality. It was a civic group led by formerly incarcerated persons that was incubated by CRS. I'm going to examine how former gang members and formerly incarcerated persons participate in faith-based community organizing, as well as the meaning of faith-based community organizing to them. Okay, so to start, I would say that there's 4 themes that characterize the literature on the post-incarceration experience. The first one is rooted in the Chicago School of Sociology. This is a social ecology perspective. This strand of literature emerged from the earliest studies of gangs and has emphasized urban development and social disorganization. According to this perspective, you have to change social structures in order to reduce crime and incarceration. A second theme has focused squarely on crime and desistance. And so work in this field has suggested that mainstream institutional ties, such as getting married, right, marriage, work, entrance into the military, or religious participation can facilitate desistance from crime. Scholars in this tradition have drawn from role exit and life course development theories to explain desistance. A third theme has focused on mass incarceration, reform, and reentry. Work in this area has celebrated and also critiqued recent criminal justice reforms. And lastly, a fourth theme has been characterized by Foucauldian critiques of neoliberalism. According to this literature, the neoliberal state socializes ex-offenders into risk-bearing subjects. Workfare and behavior modification subordinate ex-offenders to contingent labor markets. While these perspectives illuminate some facets of the post-incarceration experience, they are often inadequate in accounting for the dynamics of former gang members or formerly incarcerated persons' civic and political engagement. Social ecology influenced perspectives and desistance research, for example, have largely underestimated the central role of conflict in the study of crime. Okay, and another thing I want to point out, especially being here in Atlanta, is that the Chicago School plagiarized W.B. Du Bois' work. This concept of social organization first comes out of W.B. Du Bois' work, but W.B. Du Bois was concerned with race and politics, how there was a need for education to learn about the Black experience, to mobilize people, to build leadership, to have a social movement to change things. And the Chicago School plagiarizes Du Bois' work and sanitizes it of anything that had to do with race and politics. It makes it seem as if, we have unequal social structures, for things that have anything to do, anything for any reason that have anything to do besides, race. Mass incarceration and prison or reentry literature has provided a better understanding of the ongoing conflicts over penal reform, but not of the role of civic religion. And lastly, Foucauldian critiques of state-sanctioned rehabilitation and faith-based rehabilitation have suggested that faith-based recovery perpetuates self-blame in ways that undermine collective and political action. Okay, so what does a sociology of religion perspective afford us? A sociology of religion perspective suggests that religion has often been central to social movements. There's been more recent work that's come out about W.E.B. Du Bois's life, and we know now that as progressive as his writings were, he was also, and as much as he called out the church for not fulfilling its mission of reaching out to those people that were furthest on the margins. He actually defended the church when progressives would attack churches and say, they were too conservative. Du Bois called those people fools and said that, that it was the entire church that mattered. Both the conservative base as well as the more progressive wing. The reason why Du Bois was so effective in his writing and in his speaking was because he spoke the language of prophetic spirituality, where white Protestant reformers talked about individuals being saved. There was this tradition that came out of the Black church in the Reconstruction era that was concerned with society sinning in the eyes of God, right, through things like slavery and racist laws, and this belief that you had to get rid of these racist structures in order to redeem society in the eyes of God. Religion, Richard Wood tells us that religion is a structure that can organize to effect social change. Religious groups, quote, offer resources for interpreting an ambiguous political world and contest political power through conflict and compromise. So the type of work that Du Bois did could be conceptualized as a new abolitionism. The Black church's efforts to try to grapple with inequality after slavery had ended, right? Trying to understand what this new system of inequality looks like, trying to protect people from it, trying to mobilize people to change it. This is the work that Du Bois was doing among many others, and this is the long arc of his contribution, to the development of Black consciousness in 20th century America, which, gives rise to the NAACP, organizing work at Black colleges and universities in the South, the civil rights movement, and even the United Farm Workers movement, because Marshall Gans was involved with Freedom Summer. Marshall Gans was involved with Freedom Summer, and when he goes to the United Farm Workers to work with Cesar Chavez, he implements a lot of the tactics that he learns, like boycotts. Okay, so how big is faith-based community organizing today? Well, a census was undertaken in 1999 and in 2012, and it found an increase in the number of organizations that were affiliated with these coalitions that do faith-based community organizing. There were 4,000 member organizations in 1999 and 4,500 in 2012. The majority of this increase, almost all of this increase, can be traced to developments in the ways that faith-based community organizing has changed. Because the demographics of this country are changing, because people are mobilizing around issues that affect communities of color. Now faith-based community organizing has shifted its focus from things that it traditionally did in the 80s and 90s, like healthcare access, education, affordable housing, to things like immigration reform and anti-mass incarceration initiatives. And so the growth in the member organizations are mostly secular organizations like labor unions, parent groups, and a lot of these groups are aligned with issues and causes that affect communities of color. I'll give some examples of faith-based community organizing that involves the rights of the formerly incarcerated. As the work of Michael Leo Owens here at Emory shows, in 2004, Open Doors successfully campaigned to expand probationers and parolees' voting rights in the state of Rhode Island. In 2007, the Los Angeles Metropolitan Church's Ex-Offender Action Network held an action against MCI's high rates of prison phone calls. They then held a successful campaign to reallocate $40 million of a community bank's funds to benefit formerly incarcerated persons. In the 2010s, Pico, California waged a Lifelines to Healing campaign, organizing to advance ban the box bills, ordinances, and policies. So these are these are ordinances and bills and policies that remove the felony conviction question from applications, so that an employer cannot ask, "Have you ever been convicted of a felony?" Some folks would say this matters a lot because you want to give formerly incarcerated people a chance. The research shows that if they have a chance to meet an employer, the employer will form ideas about this person, before they see anything in their record. So, for example, if I have a record and I interview for a job and then they run a background check, the employer will be more likely to think about, what's on my record. Maybe I did something, a very low-level crime when I was 19 years old, a long time ago, and this employer will say, well, Ed Flores deserves a second chance because he seems like a good person, and this crime is relatively minor. But when that tick box is there, the research shows that employers are more likely to discriminate. Now, this is actually a more complex issue because the research also shows that whites with a record are more likely to get jobs than blacks that don't have a record. But the reason why this matters is because the people in my study, people of color that are formerly incarcerated, saw this as a barrier to their full participation in society. And being able to engage in policy, right, in policy debates, and to speak with the legislators about this issue and to try to find solutions was a type of empowerment that many of them had never experienced. And this spills over into other things. So it doesn't just become about ban the box. It becomes about, jobs. It becomes about other things. And, the other issues I mentioned earlier, affordable housing or education. Okay, so I just want to put that caveat out there. And one last thing, many of these efforts emerged out of prisoner reentry programming and violence prevention efforts. Okay, so the very things that the Foucauldian scholars would say are teaching people to blame themselves are actually giving birth to civic and political activism. And so this is what I'll talk about today. Okay, so my questions for understanding faith-based community organizing for and among the formerly incarcerated are: how do faith-based organizations foster community organizing to expand the rights of formerly incarcerated people? How do former gang members and formerly incarcerated people participate in faith-based community organizing? This book was founded on fieldwork from 2012 to 2015. I attended regular meetings, leadership meetings, worship assemblies, coalition meetings, lobby day visits to the state capitol. I also sent letters to elected officials and set up a few meetings with elected officials. I was not in the room during some of the big prep sessions with the leaders. Those were probably the only times that I wasn't in the room. I used the extended case method to engage in theory reconstruction rather than theory refutation. So I tried to understand the relationship between these social interactions and processes and the historical context and theory and positionality from the stance of trying to understand things that were anomalous. So I'm not trying to disprove any theory. I'm just trying to understand this anomaly that people who are involved in prisoner reentry are now involved in civic and political action, and how does that happen? I found that that people engaged in faith-based community organizing, not necessarily because it benefited them, but because it afforded them the space to engage in these performances of being reformed. So, for example, Eddie, who I'll talk about a little later, he had served 14 years in prison. And the types of things that were on his record, right, were serious enough that, like, the Illinois ceiling bill that he was leading a campaign around wouldn't actually benefit him. But he saw it as his mission to get this bill passed because he felt it would help other people that had lower level records. And he felt like this was part of his mission to do good for the community and to redeem himself. Okay, so the Community Renewal Society is Chicago's oldest social justice organization. It was founded by congregational ministers, and on their website, they proclaimed this, this radical racial history, providing legal counsel for slaves after an infamous slave ship mutiny. Most clergy and members were from large Black Protestant congregations on the South Side, but other congregations were also represented in CRS, largely white, suburban churches on the West and Northwest sides, and as well as Latino and Black Catholic churches. Eddie became a CRS organizer in training in return for CRS's support of his organizing activities with force. So CRS wanted him as an organizer, and he said the only way he would take the job is if 1/3 of his time could be dedicated to force, and they agreed. At its inception, Force was a small community organizing group with a core membership no larger than a dozen persons. It was composed exclusively of adults, many with gang past, mostly men, all Black and Latino except for one person who was Middle Eastern. And Eddie proudly stated at every meeting that this group was led by ex-offenders. So I know, like, we've come a long way in the past 5-6 years thinking about how to use language in ways that don't stigmatize people with records. And so there's a lot of terms that we use now, like people with records, justice-involved people. In my work, folks regularly use the term ex-offender. And so that's why I use it. There's really no sort of standard term that people have adopted to say, this is the label that we're going to use, because these were folks that were involved in civic and political action, and this was, the term that they used to describe themselves. I use it. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the signature concept in my book, Prophetic Redemption. I conceptualize prophetic redemption as the use of religious displays to expand the boundaries of democratic inclusion and to foster social integration among those furthest on the margins. And I argue that this comes out of, that this concept is in line with Du Bois's work, because Du Bois is the first to talk about social organization in relationship to social problems such as crime. And Du Bois conceptualized civic and political change as being intimately tied with personal reform at the same time. The work of theologians like Helene Slessor of Jameer, who's conceptualized progressive prophetic activism, tells us that American community organizing has used the term prophetic in reference to a religious understanding of politics defined by its inclusiveness, its concern for the other and those who are marginalized. And Slessor of Jameer has claimed that modern prophetic activists draw from the prophetic book's treatment of Israel, which provides a framework useful for holding politicians or corporate leaders accountable for their corruption, greed, and exploitation of others. So in the Bible, there's this idea of coming out of Babylon, that the world is corrupt and one needs to go against these things that are in the world that we live in. And so this is what prophetic activism is. I use the term prophetic redemption to refer to the application of the theodicy of prophetic activism to efforts to redeem and to socially integrate formerly incarcerated persons living on the margins. So here are some examples of the campaigns that CRS and Force worked on. The Illinois House Bill 5723-3061, which expanded the list of sealable offenses for employment application background checks. A Walgreens corporate campaign that removed the felony conviction question. They didn't just remove the question, they also got Walgreens to agree to have partnerships with local halfway houses and to hire people from those halfway houses. An absolute bars legislative campaign in Illinois, which got rid of lifetime bars for felony disqualification in healthcare and education employment. And a reclaim legislative campaign in Cook County, Illinois, aiming to reduce trial wait times and jail costs and to redirect those funds into restorative justice and education. So Illinois had one of the longest trial wait times in the country, which meant that if you got arrested and you wanted to go before the judge and present your case and you couldn't pay bail, you were stuck in jail the entire time. And so having a long trial wait time, and a lot of people's lives were upended because they lost their jobs, like their lives fell apart. So they wanted to reduce the trial wait times from an average of 30 days to something like 10 days. And then to put the money that was saved by reducing incarceration into things like these peace hubs that operate on a local level with schools and communities. This picture is of the lobby days, the lobby day event in 2014 when about 500, 2013, when about 500 people from Community Renewal Society visited the state capitol and spoke to legislators. All of these campaigns that I mentioned were successful campaigns. Okay, so the first thing I would say about prophetic redemption is it's political. And I'll describe how it's political. So in 2012, CRS held its biannual worship assembly at Pullman Presbyterian, a Black Protestant church on Chicago's South Side. About 200 people gathered, representing largely progressive Protestant churches of different denominations from across the Chicagoland area in Cook County. Pastor Eddie Knox, the African-American leader of Pullman Presbyterian, walked up to the altar and enthusiastically got congregants to participate in the worship assembly with call and response interactions. He shouted twice into the microphone, "Are you excited?" Pastor Knox then opened it with a prayer that focused on the downtrodden. Proclaiming that we were all there to serve God's will, Pastor Knox finished with 3 thunderous amens. The drummer and choir at the back of the stage immediately launched into a melodic rock performance of God is Good All the Time, imploring us to move to the music as they swayed side to side, smiling and wearing their bright orange CRS Faith in Action t-shirts. At one point, the pastor invited Force members led by Marlon Chamberlain to the stage for a somber moment of reflection. A short video clip on Force played via projector in front of the CRS members. The clip featured several Force members publicly advocating for legislation to help expand the sealing of criminal records. Then Marlon, a Force leader in his early 30s, took to the stage. Those in Force walked up behind him. Marlon gave his personal testimony of returning from prison. He had been incarcerated for 10 and a half years under mandatory minimum sentencing. He had a son who had been 2 years old when he went to prison, and now he was 12. And although Marlon filled out several applications for employment, he never received callbacks for job interviews. Marlon's son told him he was afraid Marlon would return to the streets in prison if he could not find work. Marlon told the congregation that Illinois House Bill 5723 would allow the sealing of criminal records for persons who had nonviolent convictions and had remained crime-free for 4 years. Unapologetically, Marlon commanded the congregation to rise up and step up. He told them, "I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm reminding you that it is your obligation as people of faith." Not all of these congregations were in full support of some of these measures. So here, Marlon was agitating some of the congregations that might not have signed on to the platform for renewal for that following year. Actually, they hadn't decided the platform for renewal. So following Marlon's poignant directive, CRS leaders gave instructions for the main activity of the day, breakout sessions that immediately followed. CRS leaders led organizing workshops focused on how to move bills through the Illinois General Assembly, how fair tax works, and how to hold House meetings. CRS then caucused representatives from each congregation to vote on a platform for renewal. So out of all the items that were presented, they had a vote as a coalition, the 3 items that they would support that year. Delegates voted to place the Illinois sealing bill on the platform for renewal. This would be one of CRS's cornerstone bills for the following year. Eventually, after several lobbying trips to the state capitol, CRS and Force members successfully gathered enough support from elected officials, and it was passed as a law in 2013. Marlon's experiences with prison and recovery are reflected in functionalist-oriented scholarly literature. So I mentioned earlier, like the Chicago School and literature on crime and desistance. So this literature ostensibly could be used to explain how Marlon participated, how he desisted from crime. The literature on crime and desistance, explains how people disengage with the street through role exit, first doubts, anticipatory socialization, and turning points. However, this research falls short in fully accounting for how people like Marlon leave the street. because Marlon is participating in a type of civic and political action that's meant to change his community, to change his society. Okay, and most of the literature in criminology is just looking at how people try to change themselves. It's not looking at how people change themselves by changing their community. Okay, so how do faith-based organizations foster community organizing to expand the rights of the formerly incarcerated? So I would say, in contrast to that literature on crime and desistance, or the Chicago School, there's research that that provides a more useful framework for examining the process of desistance. So John Braithwaite's, he's an Australian criminologist. John Braithwaite's work shows that rituals of reacceptance and reabsorption following disapproval produce reintegration and reduce deviant behavior. In contexts where no rituals for reacceptance follow deviant behavior, stigmatization is relentless and reintegration does not occur. So in other words, right, we have to have rituals that allow people, to become reintegrated. This literature gives a more adequate explanation of how someone like Marlon participated in the activities of CRS. And didn't go back to selling drugs as he had done before he went into prison. Faith-based community organizing provided formerly incarcerated persons with rituals of reacceptance and reabsorption through the types of prayers that Bronstein, Fulton, and Wood found that served as cultural bridging activities. Interfaith prayers, prefigurative prayers that outline a vision of an inclusive democracy, or prayer forms that enact relationships or allow members to share practices. At a CRS leadership assembly, a poor elderly woman spoke passionately about organizing for housing reform and quoted Luke 10, beseeching members to be a neighbor to others. She urged us to be the Good Samaritan, warning, it doesn't take a lot to become the man who fell among thieves. So how do former gang members and formerly incarcerated persons participate in faith-based community organizing? Leaders translated community organizing lessons in ways that resonated with members' lived experiences. It was communicated through the discourse of recovery, such as personal testimonies and making good. So, for example, Marlon had met Eddie during a visit that Eddie made to Marlon's halfway house. Eddie had visited in an unassuming manner, screening the interrupters. He didn't tell the people there at the halfway house that he was organizing. He just told them he was going to screen this documentary that he had been in, and have a conversation with the folks at the house. After the film, Eddie distributed his business card, and Marlon followed up with a phone call. And reflecting on this experience, Marlon described it not as a chance encounter, but as a spiritual experience. He said it was, quote, ordained to happen. Marlon said he had already wanted to involve himself in getting back out and, quote, trying to help the community. Marlon said that when Eddie visited his halfway house, he was oblivious to the way that politics function. He did not understand funding allocation for programs for the formerly incarcerated or the way that sentencing guidelines were shaped by law. However, through his participation with Force, Marlon began to learn about the legislative process, the importance of voting, and how to put pressure on politicians. Marlon saw himself as a mentor to others. He said that he frequently asked himself, how can I prevent someone else from experiencing 18 years in prison? Marlon said that he saw Force as a voice in the community working on behalf of formerly incarcerated persons. This is my other finding, that what I conceptualize as prophetic redemption is personal. This resonates with literature in a few disparate fields. Sociologist Francesca Paletta has found that civil rights era narratives of participation centered on personal and political reform, and that the telling of such stories deepened social movement activity. At the same time, criminologist Shad Maruna has found that formerly incarcerated persons who make good actively distort their situation in order to find reason and purpose in life. So we all know that formerly incarcerated people face tremendous obstacles after being released from prison. What Shad Maruna finds is that people are very much forward-looking. Through making good, former prisoners rewrite a shameful past into a productive and worthy life. We have this, a lot of folks have this assumption that for someone to make good, for someone, to leave behind a terrible past, right, that involved violence or, other other bad things, that someone has to like fully accept everything bad that they had ever done. And what Shad Maruna found was that those people that were more likely to desist from illegal behavior were not the ones that were like getting into the detail about how horrible everything they did was. The folks who desisted from from crime long term were those that found some way of being able to have a purpose in life, to make good from their past, to try to help other people, so that they wouldn't make the same mistake. Folks who were more forward-looking and thinking, there's a reason and a purpose why I went through the experience that I went through, and it's to help other people, to prevent other people from experiencing the same thing. Prophetic redemption is personal, again. Members draw from recovery's ritualized verbal displays to rearticulate the meaning of community organizing as reform. So, for example, members opened and closed prayers members opened and closed meetings with prayers. As we closed our eyes and bowed our heads and at times formed a circle and held hands, the member who led a prayer gave us an inspirational quote or spoke in a stream of consciousness way. A few members would repeat some of the prayer's words or murmur call and response terms used in Black Protestant churches such as yes and Lord. Sometimes a member asked to read scripture in lieu of a prayer, draw from an experience in 12-step recovery. In one case, a member read Ecclesiastes 9-11 and then told us that the rewards come to those not with talent but with commitment. Others recited prayers that relied heavily on gang recovery's notions of reformed masculinity, as I talked about in my first book. These prayers emphasized heart, willingness, and family. Prayers meshed the discourse of collective action with that of recovery, asking God to use the meeting to guide us. The latter language resembled Alcoholics Anonymous discursive prescriptions, such as accepting things beyond your control and believing in a God or a higher power. There was a wide array of organizing activity that allowed for reintegration of people. One-on-ones, house meetings, monthly meetings, meetings with elected officials, worship assemblies, prep meetings, testimonies, learning how to make an ask to an elected official, and lobby day visits to state capitol. All of this behavior was very structured. All of these actions were very structured. It wasn't about being an individual or being creative. Like in preparation for lobby days, at a meeting, we would role play, and they'd have stations. One would be a station with someone who's role-playing the part of an elected official who's definitely going to say yes. Another one was role-playing the part of an elected official who's definitely going to say no. And another one is someone who could go either way. And we would get practice, and we would be told, okay, these are the talking points. Use these talking points. And there would be a demonstration. The organizing leader would debrief from the demonstration in front of all of us. And then, we would participate, and then, it was, I have to admit, I was a little challenged because I was nervous. I'm a professor. I'm used to, being very well respected at all times. No one ever, saying anything that makes me feel like insecure about myself. But these organizers were relentless. They would say, okay, give me a rap in 30 seconds. No, that's too long. No, that's too short. You forgot to say this. You forgot to say that. In front of people, and it's like, I felt flustered. Like I could feel my face turning red. I was so awkward. And it was an incredible learning experience because what I saw was that persons who had been to prison who wanted an opportunity to demonstrate who they were, they relished these opportunities because this was a chance to show people who they were, right? And that's something that, I, with the privilege that I have, I'm not in a position where I constantly feel like I need to prove something to people, but to a lot of folks who are marginalized, right? Socially marginalized from the workforce, who didn't have very many spaces, to really, to really demonstrate who they believed that they were. This was it. Okay, they were so much more invested in these types of activities than I was when I first showed up, and I was a little hesitant and nervous and embarrassed. Okay, so this is a quote. I'm going to finish with a quote from Eddie Bocanegra, who was the first leader of Force. Eddie had spent 14 years in prison for having taken the life of another gang member when he was 17 years old. He was released at the age of 31. A couple years after he was released was when he was released, he got involved in violence prevention. Then he became the leader of Force as a community organizer. And then he left Force to take a job as the executive director for violence prevention for the YMCA of Chicago. And so this quote is from an interview that he did on the radio as he was about to take that new position. In order to reconcile the mistake he had made earlier in his life, Eddie had decided to dedicate the rest of his life towards preventing violence. Eddie took employment as a street outreach worker with Operation Ceasefire, and as he became a rising star in the Chicago community, organizers recruited him to lead Community Renewal Society's campaigns. As he was about to leave CRS, he was interviewed by WBEZ, a local radio station. And he expressed how he sought to make good from the death of William, the boy he had killed. Eddie said, quote, "All the work I'm doing is so that one day I can meet his mom and say, I don't expect you to forgive me for what I've done, but I just want you to know that everything I'm doing with the rest of my life is for him." Okay, so I'll wrap up by restating 3 points from this talk. So the first one is that what I've conceptualized is, I conceptualize prophetic redemption as that which expands the boundaries of democratic inclusion and fosters social integration among those furthest on the margins. Prophetic redemption is rooted in deeper traditions of American civic and religious engagement. And this is why the work of people like W.E.B. Du Bois is so necessary. Even if as academics we don't engage with it as much as we should be, there are people, out in the world in faith-based community organizing groups whose work has been influenced by his legacy. And so we need to understand Du Bois's work not just because of the legacy it has left in academia, but because of the imprint that it's left on the civic and the religious fabric of our nation. And my third point is that prophetic redemption is political, but it's also personal. Thank you.